All right, welcome to the second part of our lectures about how people share cities. In this section, we're going to look at the periphery and the semi-periphery. The slides were designed to accompany the textbook People, Places, and Culture, and I am, of course, Miss Gall, and I'll be your lecturer for the day. So, we're talking about the periphery and the semi-periphery, and what we really need to look at is the fact that these are places that are rapidly urbanizing, that are working on industrializing, and because of that rapid urbanization, and by rapid urbanization I mean we've got cities that have doubled, tripled, quadrupled really in the last 20 years, maybe 30 years or so. So just these huge, incredibly rapidly growing cities. Okay. So we look particularly at the economic periphery, but we also see it in the semi-periphery. Right? New arrivals and long-term residents tend to crowd together in overpopulated apartments, dismal tenements. Tenements are kind of like apartments, and just these teeming slums. And slums, remember, are just incredibly poor neighborhoods. We're talking about the periphery in particular. These are neighborhoods that people are literally building their houses out of whatever they can find. So it might be some spare metal or some spare wood or just whatever materials they can find to try and build with, they'll build with. And the trick with building in the poorer parts of the world is either there's no zoning laws, or they're not enforceable, or they are not enforced. And so what you see are these incredibly rickety buildings that are not built to any kind of code. Right here in the global core, we would never dream of occupying these type of buildings. They would just rip them down. And so it becomes a public health issue. It becomes a problem when there's any kind of a natural disaster. Even oftentimes in the periphery, in areas that get monsoon rains, just the monsoon rains alone can be a problem. And also a trick, especially in the periphery, but in the semi-periphery, is that there's this huge contrast between the wealthy and the poor. And unlike here in the global core, right, where neighborhoods are kind of segregated by wealth level, in the periphery in particular, you can see very, very wealthy people literally living their apartment building literally right next door to some of these slums and things. So it's a very different way of kind of looking at things. So in the periphery, semi-periphery, right, we've got this slum development that begins off, generally speaking, where the permanent buildings end, but also if there's spare lots or things like that, it can occur within the city itself, right? So a lot of times they spread outward from the central city, kind of roughly circular, just depending on what we're talking about. But the size of these dwellings, or these slums and things, can literally dwarf the size of the central city. And the trick is, the reason why this happens is because we've got millions and millions of people traveling into these environments every year because they're moving to the city to get jobs, to take advantage of not just economic opportunity, but social opportunity, cultural opportunities, and things like that. And in the poorer parts of the world, the city governments, literally, they don't have the resources that they need to educate, to medicate, to police, right, to clean up, to make sure people have access to infrastructure. It's not that they don't want to do it, it's that they don't have the resources they need to be able to do it. Okay? And a lot of times these slums in the poorer parts of the world, they're ethnically delineated, which is really a fancy way of saying that there's ethnic neighborhoods within these slums, right? And the new arrivals, they kind of catch as catch can. So they do the best they can, but the reality is, because they're the newest arrivals, they get the most marginal lands, they don't have the choice building materials and things like that, right? And as soon as people can move up, as soon as they can get better building materials or move into a permanent structure, they will do it, okay? All things to think about. We're talking about how people share new space in the cities in the global periphery. when we're talking about ethnicity, ethnicity also can be not exactly a synonym for power, but it can be a way in which people can gain access to power. So a lot of times under the colonial system, colonizers would pick one group or another group to privilege, and by privileging them, they would give them better access to education, more resources, and then these are the folks that they would use oftentimes to help run a lot of the day-to-day business of government. Right? And so those groups that developed that power during the colonial system, that has actually carried over into the post-colonial world. And what that means is that we've got this ongoing power structure that is influencing where people live and what jobs they have access to, what resources they have access to, things like that within these cities, right? And the other thing that you see happen, particularly in poor countries with poor governance, is the development of a large informal economy. And the informal economy is really that economy that's not taxed, it's not regulated. As a result, it doesn't count towards things like the gross national income or the gross national product. But it also doesn't, because it's not taxed, because it's not regulated, it doesn't offer any protection at all to the workers. Right? So that makes it easy to be fired, or if if you get injured on the job, or the boss suddenly decides he doesn't like you, or whatever. I mean, you could get fired. You could have everything kind of ripped out from underneath you. So it makes people much more marginal. But the reason why people are moving into the cities, the reason why they're doing a lot of this and they're willing to put up with a lot of this, is because they get better jobs. Right? Again, more access to resources. It's not that life in these cities is great, but they can make more money than they would make living on the farm, and then they're able to remit some money home or send some money home, right? We talked about this a little bit. We talked about migration, is that a lot of times when people move to wealthier areas, they're able to send money home, and that's why they move. It's not that they want to move, it's that they're able to help support the family back home. So then when we start talking about modern cities in the global periphery and semi-periphery, part of what we have to look at is the development of the colonial cities, right? And then also we can compare that with cities that have grown up to a large degree since then, or we can compare it to how cities have grown since then, right? So, for instance, geographers Richard Grant and I don't know if that's Jan Nijman or Jan Niemann, either way, went through and did some documentation looking at former colonial port cities, including Mumbai. And I mentioned Mumbai because we're going to be looking at a map of it in just another minute or two, right? But what you see when you look at these is a new spatially demarcated foreign presence that's arisen, right? Spatially demarcated, all that really means in English is that you can draw some lines on the map to show where the foreigners are in space. Okay? And as I talked about when I talked about city models, right? Every city's got a CBD. It's got that central business district, that kind of heart of downtown. In this case, it's the heart of the original colonial city, right? It's where the colonizers kind of built up their economic base. And these days, oftentimes they house mostly foreign corporations or multinational companies, things that are linked primarily to the global economies. They're not linked in locally any more than they really need to be, but they are linked in very tightly to that global economy. So just to give you some idea, right, when we look at it, we used to call it Bombay, now we call it Mumbai, right? So we've got a couple of maps here, right? And you can see the CBD in the new one roughly matches the old native town. And then we've got our industrial zones kind of roughly match up, right? We've got our docks and our warehouses and things like that. But also what you can see is we've got those upper income areas. Again, not much has changed, which is kind of a lot of what I was talking about earlier, right? But what you see are the poorer areas as well. And yes, I know, Mumbai and Bombay, not actually the same place. So, that's been our lecture about how people use space in the periphery and the semi-periphery. Mostly we talked a lot about how we've got these older cities with permanent dwellings, and then surrounding those older cities we've got the development of slums that house mostly incoming migrants, and that these slums are they're not sanitary, they're not healthy, they're not plugged into the local infrastructure, right? And the reason why they develop is because the governments they don't have the resources, they don't have the money to build up the infrastructure necessary to support the people who live in these slum areas. What ends up happening then is, so people move to the city because they want to get better jobs, or they think that the city's exciting and they want more social opportunities or things like that, and they end up, a lot of times, they're sending money out home. And because they're sending money home, they're willing to put up with conditions that are not all that great. I mean, they're literally, especially the newer arrivals, they're kind of catching as catch can. They're sleeping where they can, they're finding building materials where they can to try and establish themselves as in a more permanent way. So if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. Please just bring them into class, and I'll see you the next time we meet.